Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So today I thought I would cover a subject that we mention every once in a while in episodes, like the Bob Lazar episode when we're talking about the propulsion system of a UFO. What we're about to talk about is antimatter. And just as theories like the Big Bang are very appealing because without having a science degree, one can claim they know how the universe began, I want all of this stuff to be that easy for you to understand and repeat to someone else. We may not achieve that. I did my episode on quantum computing. I think once quantum computing connects in your head, you will be able to explain how quantum computing works in a way that, won't take you much effort. But up until the point you understand that you have this, atom twirling from 0 to 1, from the North Pole to the South Pole, constantly, and therefore when you put it into a mathematical equation, it is calculating every possibility at the exact same time, roughly. That's pretty cool, right? But with antimatter, it has been one of these things where I've read so much like sci-fi about it, which what I mean by that is stuff that claims to be science, but when you really read the fine print, everything is based on a paper that was totally theoretical, that was based on another paper that was totally theoretical. The amount of papers written around antimatter, what it could be, how it could be created, we can make it today on Earth. It's an extremely expensive stuff to make because it barely ever occurs. But the idea is, what is it? Bob Lazar talked about it being part of a propulsion system at the bottom of a UFO. What the hell does that mean? How would that even work? How does antimatter propulsion work? So I want to get into it a little bit and then kind of dive around the subject because from my research, the people that postulated it to exist before they got really a mechanical confirmation of it were all ethereal-based scientists. And then, of course, you can't know about it because, to understand ethers, to understand all the energy in the universe, it will teach you why electricity crawls along wood and looks like the veins in your lungs, which also looks like, the branches on a tree. You start to understand the whole thing. It's really funny. And it just suddenly you realize there's one law of physics for everything. The laws of the universe are universal. And so it really sums everything up. But there is a perspective and there's a relativity to your body, your mind, perceiving things that will make things like water curving into a ball in space not make any sense to you if you are relative to the ground and seeing everything flat. I just want to throw that out there. But while you're looking at the flat Earth going, see, water can't curve, I'm going to pour a big beer right next to you, and then I'm going to hold it up to your face and go, see those bubbles in there? What are those doing? And you're going to be like, shut up. So you guys have heard of an electron, right? Electron, proton, neutron, right? Neutron's neutral, proton is positive, pro, and electron is negative. Now, I'll try to spare a little bit of this stuff, but you have to, for the hardcore listeners, you have to understand people will find this episode and have never watched the other episodes, so there'll be a little bit of repetition. If you aren't able to repeat the other episodes, repetition's good for you. Not that it's what I'm trying to brainwash you to believe, but at least if you're going to, study this as a potential theory in your own mind, being able to repeat it will give you the power to either destroy the theory in your mind or to get on board. Again, this isn't me telling you everything that's right. I definitely have my beliefs. I definitely communicate them as if I do believe them. And I don't always say alleged or maybe when I maybe should. For me, I've seen so much evidence of this stuff working. I'm done trying to pepper everything with maybes anymore. Now, you're listening to someone who believes that ether exists. I believe it because Faraday found it. I believe it because Tesla found it. And I believe it because Eric Dollard rediscovered it using their experiments from the 1800s, using a wire at an RCA naval laboratory in the late 70s. I would love to be present during one of these experiments, but the way they say it works is a 7-foot wire can do it. You wave it in the air, and there's a disturbance on the wire in a particular frequency where you can deduce the fact that ether is moving 50 times the speed of light. Now, for some of you, let's take the speed of light as an example because I think it'll become useful here. They tell you that the speed of light is constant. But if you go and study it, you'll realize that a lot of universities have almost unanimously reported different speeds. Not terribly different, but different. Now, what I think is going on in that particular situation, I do believe personally that light has a fixed speed, whatever that is. So, at 186,000 miles per second, why would these universities be reporting slightly different responses from the measurement of time, or measurement of light, excuse me? And I'm pretty sure we're all on the same page that it's the medium by which the light was traveling that would affect its ability to get from to in a straight line unimpeded by perhaps gravity waves, which would be the ethereal fabric of the universe being disturbed by anything. You don't see these waves, and if they don't factor that into your speed tests of energy, because again, light is just a wave of energy. It's a transverse wave of energy. It's like flipping the sheets on your bed or taking a rope and flipping it. Like the ripples in the pond. You know, again, I always have this analogy. It really strikes people immediately. They get it when I say, if I sent you out into a pond that's up to your waist, and I say, okay, I'm going to throw a rock. It's going to be right next to you. When you see the ripples, I want you to pick them up and bring them to me. And then you look at me like, what are you, crazy? And the idea is you understand you can't pick up a temporary verb of water movement and bring it to me. It isn't a thing. It is a movement. It's a verb. Okay. Well, let's say that Faraday and Tesla, the two gentlemen discovered electricity because it already existed, right? They discovered it and then invented all of the base components that fueled Ohm, Volta, mixing up all their names, but Ohm and Volta and all the other brilliant geniuses that put together the base components of which then Tesla jumped off on, and a bunch of other folks, of course. Ether has a constant pace. It never slows down and it never speeds up. Now, I want you to think about that for a split second. It never slows down and it never speeds up. There's no entropy, there's no inertia. It merely can be given a longer path before it's either recognized or before it is recognized as perhaps mass, right? Because if something's moving 50 times the speed of light, you're not going to recognize it as mass. It won't even be plasma at that speed because it's going too quickly. It's flowing through us. If it makes us, everything you can see right now in your world, everything is made from ether. This one thing. It is a particle in our model. It has no positive charge. It has no negative charge. That is an illusion by its behavior of how it might get stuck in a little spinning vortex or in a spinning sphere. Why a sphere? Because ether is everywhere. Just like the bubble in water, right? You can look at a bubble in water and you're like, dude, it's round. Yeah. Okay, where's the water? Well, it's everywhere. Where's the bubble? Right there. Why is it round? Well, because the water is equally pushing on the air that's in the water. It's how the earth exists. It's how all things exist. It's a natural formation. Now, someone might say, well, how does a particle exist if this stuff keeps moving? Aha. There are entry points into the sphere and there are exit points to the sphere. No one need create another dimension in time, a fourth dimension, to understand this. For instance, when you see, again, the vortex of water in your bathtub, when you pull the drain, or in your sink in your kitchen, and I say, well, how does that thing exist right there? And you say, well, because the water is going through this behavior, making that thing. I'm like, okay, well, how does it sustain its existence? Well, it keeps, there's tons of water here, and it's just all, you see how the tornado gets a little shorter as the water level goes down, but it's still there. It's a Fibonacci pattern, is what it is. It's just not making a leaf or a cactus or a rosebud, right? There's my homage to the comment about Citizen Kane. So, antimatter and matter, they're just classifications. That's all they are. It's the same exact stuff made of the same exact stuff. It's just that there is a behavior that is rare. So far, it is rare in the universe that this occurs. For instance, let's just say the world's round, a heliocentric ball, and it's going around another ball, which is a plasma ball at the center. It's covered in all this, burning material on the outside. The inside's cold as ice. It's empty. Same as the Earth, same as the Moon, same as everything in space. But we have this orbit that is the natural orbit of the Earth. Well, I forgot what it is, but it's there's an orbit that is the natural orbit of all objects going around the Earth, and it really is the way that we launch everything. So when we go from Cape Canaveral in Florida and we launch everything over the Atlantic Sea, that is the natural spin of all things that are in orbit around Earth. When something goes the opposite direction, like when SpaceX launches something over the Pacific, it can't rendezvous with things going the opposite direction despite all the BS they tell you. So that's usually a spy satellite they're putting over there to watch our neighbors across the ocean. There's a famous satellite in space called the Black Knight satellite, which has got ufologists on edge because they theorize it's been up there for 13,000 years to 35,000 years. NASA claims it's a blanket that was lost during some EVA mission. The only thing is the photographs consistently show it in the same exact orientation. Plus, it hasn't fallen out of orbit, which is a natural thing that would occur. But that object, in some weird way, which counteracts the NASA theory, is going in the opposite direction. Now, maybe there's something about a launch I don't know from NASA, but it's going the opposite direction. The reason why I mentioned that little orbit digression is that we have ether that is going to be spinning in one direction, and it's considered a negative. And then we have a particle that spins in the opposite direction is considered a positive. You know that positive and positive repulse each other, but positive and negative attract to each other. The simplest way to think about this is two car tires bumping into each other like a Formula One car with an open tire situation, no fenders protecting the tires. If two of those guys bump each other, bump their tires, most likely the guy in the back is going to be sent in the air because the tires are going the same direction. So when they collide, the front one's going to kick up the back one. However, if in some strange universe, the person coming up behind him had a tire going the opposite direction as the back tire he's about to bump, they're going to marry each other perfectly because they're going to be going together. It's a beautiful thing. If you're building a Swiss watch, you know you would never make a gear go in the same direction as another gear and try to butt them up against each other because they're going to fight for strength. Same thing that's going on in the universe with ether. Matter is nothing but ether getting caught in various configurations of swirling, just like water gets caught in all kinds of configurations of swirling as it bumps into rocks, as it bumps into the ocean floor, a beachfront, a bridge pylon. It's doing all kinds of crazy things when you look at it. I think Bruce Lee was ethereal based. He always said, be like water. So, we know we have ether moving in a bunch of different directions. And what's beautiful about ether is it explains electricity absolutely perfectly. And the more you study Eric Dollard, the more you're going to completely understand ether at just the most basic level. It completely explains gravity. When you hear things like, gravity doesn't exist or gravity's bullshit, what that really means is that the definitions that have been given to the public to describe ether are so incorrect that when you figure out that it's BS, it doesn't make any sense. It's like someone who was Catholic at one point, was touched by a preacher or beat up by a nun. They throw the whole, religion out with that particular version of Christianity, not giving themselves a chance to find a different version of Christianity which doesn't have all the pedophilia and, ruler beating, right? Gravity, by their, phenomenon definition of mass exchanging some force between mass, is all BS. It doesn't mean that I'm not sitting in this chair effortlessly. I'm not floating in space. I'm not floating around the backyard. And so what I call ether is the process of being pushed down to this patio. Now, for those of you guys who want to say, oh, it's density and buoyancy, if you go back to my original Flat Earth series of episodes, you'll hear me suggest the same thing until I remembered in physics class, we took a chamber, vacuumed out all the air with a feather in it, and my teacher just turned it like crazy, and the feather was still falling up and, falling according to the forces of gravity that the Earth creates. Very simply, gravity is the negative pressure between two bodies that are blocking ethereal winds because they're so big. The sun's gigantic. It creates, it really doesn't create like a vacuum cleaner situation. Gravity is one of the weakest forces in the universe, but it still is big enough to keep us in this orbit. We're big enough to keep that picture of a moon up there. And I would say if we're in a simulator of some sort, then that's what the simulator is trying to simulate for us, But nothing would stop a simulator from modeling mass and energy in this particular manner. But now, okay, we know that if you spin ether one way, it's considered a negative. If you spin it the other way, it's considered a positive. But it still is not considered antimatter. It's straight up matter. It just has two different general behaviors. The CERN Hadron Collider smashes two protons together, two positively charged particles, after accelerating them inside these amazing tubes using electricity to keep the waves from banging into each other, go in the same direction. They want to accelerate them up at this extreme speed, and then they modulate these two waves until they bang into each other. They want them to bang at each other at precisely the points inside the collision disks, okay, these big giant disks that you see. What those things are is a bunch of sensors that have been mashed together such that when this energy blows up, when these two things hit each other, which are obviously teeny tiny, it's hurling off all of the ethereal mass that makes up this proton. Because the disks are stacked horizontally in these round pizza shapes, right? Those disks will sense the collision as it cuts through all of the different slivers. They use this, I believe it's called a Sigma 5 algorithm, that filters out white noise to say this is probably just ancillary explosion energy. But anything that starts twirling, they start to classify that as a subatomic particle, a quark of some sort. Okay, or they'll declare something new if it has, more advanced behaviors. How many of you have heard of a positron? Even on Star Trek. You might have an antiproton, antineutron. But a positron is a really easy way to say it because it is the opposite of an electron. And there are various techniques that when they do collide two protons together, they get essentially antiprotons, antiproton matter coming off this thing. What this is generally classified as is when it intersects and comes in contact with its cousin on the other side, right? It's maybe it's the evil cousin and evil brother, and the other one's the good brother, whatever. They cancel each other out. But now what I want you to do, and they let off a tremendous amount of energy when the two touch. And this is where we get antimatter engine theory. This is where we get antimatter fuel theory. This is where we get antimatter triggers for nuclear bombs. And this is where we can actually theorize an antimatter atomic bomb. I think the lowest yield atomic bomb that an antimatter particle could create would be a 43 megaton bomb, which outdoes the gigantic bomb that the Russians detonated, which is the biggest one ever, which they're not quite sure what the magnitude of that was, which I believe is called the Tsar bomb. Okay, so if you have someone explain it to you without ethereal knowledge, the funny thing is that it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense in a physical model. I mean, you can read about their theories and go, okay, well, they say when it unravels, it lets off a bunch of energy. I'm going to attempt an analogy here. If we have ether orbiting in a particle form, right? It's made a sphere. And then you found, you have another particle orbiting in such a way that if these two collide, those orbital strengths cancel each other out, because essentially whatever's creating the crowd control for all the ethereal particles to stay in this shape, the other one is perfectly created to undo that shape and undo itself. So why would there be a gigantic release of energy? I will give you an example. How many of you have played with water in such a way that in fact, you might have been washing the dishes for the first time? I'll give you a great example. This isn't exactly technically the physical model, but we'll go back to the physical model once you understand this. How many of you have washed utensils in a sink? And it's going great. You clean your knife off because that peanut butter you didn't clean off the first day. It takes a little while. Get the water really hot. Clean off the fork. What a pain in the ass. It cuts into your sponge. Then you're cleaning a spoon, and it's going great. You got the spoon upside down, so it's hitting the convex shape. Second, you roll it over, and you just hit it just right with your hot water. You got water all over the place, right? It all of a sudden splatters off that concave shape, hits you in the face, goes all over the counter. Damn it. Now you got to clean up a big mess. So imagine a particle that's moving 50 times the speed of light. Now, it will always be not slowed down by its neighboring particles, but it will be redirected to synchronize with its neighbors. Meaning, don't create a ripple. Just go with the flow. Here's the 405 traffic. Stop driving zigzags, banging into everybody. Just go straight north or south. You pick it. So you have, in order to have even an electron, you have an enormous amount of ethereal particles that have to participate in that orbit to create something that you can recognize as an electron, which is a very small atomic element. But now you bang it against a positron, its opposite cousin that can undo it as well as be undone by it, by its friend. Okay. That undoing process is just as crazy and as messy as accidentally putting the water down in that spoon when you're cleaning it. Except it's worse. It does the spoon trick. Instead of just popping up out of the concave shape of a spoon, it is doing that in every single direction. And it is obviously surrounded, just like the bubble in the glass, it's surrounded by water, which if I said, where's the water around the bubble? You say, well, it's everywhere around the bubble. Okay. You mean there's a lot of particles pushing on the bubble? Yeah. And they're moving around constantly? Yeah. But that thing still remains a round, perfect sphere? Yeah. Okay. So I want to keep reminding you guys of that. So imagine that whole thing disintegrating because of literally opposite polarities that undo each other. And it's messy. It's flying around like crazy. That starts to create a cascade of realized matter in a chaotic form. It can thermalize. It can turn into plasma. It gets messy. Which is why if you made an atomic bomb out of such a thing, say a gram of this stuff, which I think would cost a couple $1 billion to make a gram. Be a hell of an expensive bomb. But it is going to be the most disruptive thing. If we ever created that bomb, whatever would be in its path would be so utterly obliterated. I don't think we've ever seen anything like that in world history. And believe me, we never do. Now, these crazy scientists are creating this stuff. How they maintain it, I'm not exactly sure, because how would you maintain antimatter inside of a matter container. How do you keep it from touching the edge? Now, once it's created, and we're going to go back to its creation, but once it's created, and if you could control it, then, again, the possibilities are actually very interesting. Bob Lazar's ship, which again, I kind of got to the end of my episode, and because of his claimed 2 degrees in 2 different places at the same time, not the same time necessarily, but he has no photographs from going to college at MIT. I mean, come on. The fastest degree this dude could get, even with his advanced brain, would be at least a couple of years. You would have some Polaroids in the early 80s, you know, very specifically, of being there for a long time. You would have been at a dorm. You would have driven a car. I mean, you would have registration papers. You'd have a million proofs about that, plus anyone who was his cousin, uncle, aunt, father, mother, brother, sister, whatever, buddy, would be like, I got this buddy named Bob Lazar. The dude just finished his degree at Caltech, and now he's over at MIT. He's getting his physics degree. You know, be back in 7 years, you know, or maybe 5 at the earliest, right? The dude would have been displaced for a really long time. So I think his story's bunk simply because of those claims. I mean, the only way that he could still be on target and have those claims is if those claims were brainwashed into his mind. I don't know. But I'm done trying to bail people out of their own bullshit, right? But here's the interesting thing about an antimatter engine participating in moving some sort of object or vehicle through space and having complete command over gravity. When you're dealing with antimatter, you are dealing with the very orbital instincts of ether. What it typically does. You know, it typically creates the atomic elements that we're aware of. Perhaps it creates quarks as well. But it's also creating anti-everything else if this is true. So what would be a great methodology for saying, you know, all gravity is ethereal winds pushing down on us relative to our perspective of being on this ball in space. That's why I'm sitting here. You know, it's also making all the oxygen above me, and there is a pressure on top of me as well. For slightly other reasons, right? But if you wanted to move around space effortlessly, then you're going to want to move ether out of the way to create a negative pocket in front of your ship so that your ship will just naturally flow in that pocket. Why? Because ether is everywhere, pushing on every side of you. And if you can create a device that creates a frequency that starts to move stuff out of the way, you'll just fall into that space. How many of you have had a Cheerio floating on the zero gravity plane of milk, and you put your spoon in there and you break the tension of the milk and the Cheerio goes bam up against it? Cheerios actually glom together partially because of the tension of the surface of milk, but a lot of it's just straight up gravity. They're creating little negative pockets between each other and they go bam. It's cool. But the Cheerios are not exchanging information. Going, hey, come over here. I'm the phenomenon gravity. What? Oh, yeah, sure. Nah, they're just being pushed together by ether. Now, in order to command ether to construct these antimatter particles, which science in its serendipity have created and figured out how there's a bunch of different ways they're created, it's very rare. And so the first thing the scientists who discovered this antimatter behavior in antimatter, I don't want to say mass, antimass, was that they were like, well, wait a minute. There's this old theory, for every reaction there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, on a mathematical level, that would mean that for every particle of matter, there should be a particle of antimatter. But they cannot figure that out. They can't find that anywhere in the universe. It is still an extremely rare thing that happens. You know, it could. It could just be simply a really, really rare configuration that ends up happening. For those of you who've ever really paid attention to moving your arm through the surface of the water in a pool, and you watch all those little vortexes, because it distorts light, right? It refracts light, and so you can actually watch the bottom of a pool. I know that every single one of you have done this. You move your hand over, and you see those little tornadoes You don't actually see them in the water half the time, but you see the refraction of the currents that you've created with your hand spiraling out of existence at the surface of water. You're absolutely looking at, de facto, the same exact algorithms of ether at the subatomic level. I promise you. Well, what's the majority of the water doing? The majority of the water is moving with your hand as you move it, but these little tiny vortexes are like these little barnacle fish that are chasing after the big fish, you know, as an analogy. So it could be that as mass forms in the universe, again, if you look out there in space, if it's truly out there, and it's not a vacuum, but it's actually a big pool of ether out there, well, we think we can see the moon because there's nothing between it. There is a bunch of stuff between it. There's these particles moving 50 times the speed of light between us and the moon. I can be right underneath the moon and I don't float out in space because there's still ether pushing down on top of me. Okay. The same orbital lock that the moon might be in is the same orbital lock an electron will have towards its core of a proton-neutron. Same thing. But now if you could unravel all of the, let's just take the moon and say we have an anti-moon. So we're gonna essentially go into that inner space thing where we've zoomed down, we've shrunken ourselves way down, and now the Earth is the proton and the moon is an electron. But here comes an anti-moon, a positron. If we're up there watching it, you know, it's probably some black void in space, right? And it's coming at the moon. You suddenly can't see the stars because it's blocking it, and they start touching. If all of that ethereal matter, which is just simply behaving in an opposite behavior, completely opposite behavior, not just an opposite spin, and it hits that moon, which is going in the normal orientation of all mass in the universe, you're going to have a supernova at a level that maybe the universe hasn't seen. I mean, it's going to make like the Horsehead Nebula in 1 second, the way this thing's going to unravel and go nuts. Probably the amount of, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it would actually create any photons that we could see, because maybe everything's being canceled out so much that we wouldn't see it. But I would hate to think that there'd be this giant pocket that's just a void of everything, because this stuff canceled out so well that the black space that we see, which is, again, not a vacuum, it's full of incredibly dense, not infinitely dense, but incredibly dense ether, it just turns back into that stuff. And it just starts participating someplace else as it moves around the universe. Now, Bob Lazar's spaceship, the theory goes as follows, if you didn't see my episode 401. There's an element 115 that back in the early 90s, when Bob Lazar came clean, which is technically, I think, 89, we couldn't make 115. We theorized it, but we'd never made it. I think in 2003, we slammed two elements together to get to the 115 count. But according to him, this 115, which is extremely difficult to create, not quite as bad as antimatter, but you create it in these little coin-shaped cylinder slices, and they would stack them up, but they'd also rotate them as they're stacking them up, because they have a natural magnetic pole around them, like all mass does. So when they rotate them a little bit as they stack them up, they start to do what a coil does. A coil and a wire can take the amperage of a current and double it every single time it reconnects with the previous coil, because it's compounding the force. Again, I'm trying to think of how that would be easily described. You've seen, wrestlers do haymakers, right? So you can punch someone with your fist, and it has so much power. But if you were to clasp both your hands and then jump up in the air and hit them with both hands, you're compounding the pressure that's going to transfer from you into the other person, and you start breaking bones and probably consequently hurting your hand. So that's kind of what a coil does. It compounds the frequencies because they team up. It's the bridge, like I always say, that gains the frequency. It's built at the frequency of the wind that goes by on a windy day, and eventually the bridge starts, oscillating and then breaks. which is why we build bridges better today. So to finish this thing off, they take these little discs and they rotate them to create this significantly more powerful natural frequency out of the 115. And then he said they lathe it down to a cone. I guess you could just think of a little piece of incense, that looks like the cone. But make that about, I think it's about 3 inches tall, something like that. And then he said, once they get it to the cone format, they then slice off one side, go equally over about, it looked to me like he was about a 1/4 inch, and they slice the other side. So everything else is just thrown away, which is the majority of this 115 is really cut away. Then you have this slice of this cone that is made up of a bunch of rotating cylinders of this stuff, and that particular shape supposedly is the ultimate shape to continually exponentially increase the natural frequency / ethereal wind off of this 115. Then they put it inside this half dome container with a rod that went up to the ceiling, which then goes out into an arc, which goes into the top of each one of the antimatter engines, being 3. I hope that doesn't get totally nuts for you. Now, from that point, he's a little bit hazy on, at least in all the lectures I've ever seen him, on exactly how the thing is stimulated from that point. It would seem like you wouldn't necessarily want it to be a constant. Maybe it is a constant, and there's something else they can do to juice it up. Maybe just hit that little bell down there and it goes a little nuts. But at that point, it's then metabolized in these big cylinders, and he gave us the impression they're about 10 inches to a foot in diameter, these cylinders that hang on these spindles. I guess through the center of the spindle is coming this frequency from the 115. And then by rotating these cylinders, you can start to create directional movement from your ship. Now, the cool thing that he clarified in the documentary, which I never heard him say in his lectures in the 90s and the early 2000s, was that the ship actually flies upside down. So the one in the intro to this show is sort of a joke. It's the normal 1950s impression of how this thing could work. He does say that that's possible by taking all the antimatter engines and pointing them at one side, and you can suck the ship directly to its side. But he says when it makes long journeys, it actually turns belly up and points the belly of the ship exactly at its target, and then it just hauls butt straight towards the target. I think that's kind of cool. What isn't clear to me is why they would call it an antimatter engine. Apparently, I've never heard the 115 being accused of creating antimatter, but perhaps it creates so much energy that whatever's in these cylinders, which is again supposedly in these ancient diagrams from previous cultures that have lived here on Earth, it is able to metabolize the frequency to start creating this anomaly in the universe that is antimatter. Now, what's interesting about it for me is that with just basic theory of ether, there's no need for antimatter whatsoever. It's just romantic to say antimatter. But if you just create a normal frequency of ethereal wind, same stuff you get out of a magnet, for instance, right? The magnet's moving the shavings on the piece of paper if you do that little experiment. Well, as long as that stuff is, it's all ether in general, but as long as you can command a pole of ether that is so fast and so dense, it will start pushing back. It starts becoming like the wall of the sun, which is a big plasma interior wall. The bottom of the ship should glow because it will end up slowing down enough in its path, not slowing down necessarily speed, but its path increases through its configuration that it starts to glow because it starts to create this ripple of energy that our eyes recognize as light. I hope this is not getting lost anywhere. So they've come up with this term, I believe it's pronounced barogenesis or barogenesis. It is the moment in which this anomaly occurs between matter and antimatter, when it starts to do the unraveling process. They've got a name for it. So when they figured this out, they were able to go out and start to look for antimatter. really a positron. And what they discovered was that beta radiation from isotopes actually creates this. And that makes sense, because an isotope would be something that would be on an ethereal level fairly violent. You ever wonder why uranium is so radioactive? It's because it is an unstable thing in the universe. An atom has become so heavy and so complex, from 233 to 237, somewhere in there. That's the range of uranium, that you get anomalies, you get weirdness. And it's a fascinating thing that uranium can exist, that anything radioactive, naturally radioactive, can exist, because it's sort of suggesting that the universe got to its limit, and that's it. Anything over that, it can't come together. I'm not saying that that's the case, but I'm sure that an atomic, a particular, say, periodic table element getting up to 450 or 550 or 1,000 is probably impossible, because it would simply take too much energy to hold it together, that there's not enough natural movement of ether to make that happen. Now, what's interesting about that is, if you start to look at the theory of ether, and if we wanted to theorize how big a particle of ether was, it might be interesting to reverse engineer the most stable atom in the universe, which might be hydrogen, all the way up to 238, and see mathematically inside of a computer if we just created basically inert particles that were teeny tiny, and we create a super dense computer model that's able to hold quadrillions of this stuff, and say a sugar cube, or the eye of a needle, quite frankly, when would we start having things naturally fall apart, where those ether particles just get to the point where they're so dense they just bang into each other constantly and they cannot settle down? And I'll give you an example of how that might go. For any of you that have seen, say, a subway system in India, China, or even Japan, they are amazing at getting on these subways, because they have way too many people and not enough mass transit. So it becomes this free-for-all. In one way, it's almost like a cordial violence getting on this thing. In India, it's so bad that they have female trains in some places in India and male trains, because they don't trust the boys to be squished so closely to the girls, because everyone's grabbing everybody's butt and other things. But now imagine, they have accepted and figured out how many people they can push, but they've got people that work for the transit companies, the train companies, and they actually go to every door before the thing can take off, and they're pushing everyone inside, and it's amazing. And then the door shuts and some guy's face is mashed up against the glass. That's a real life thing that happens. Well, that might be your uranium-238, and not another person can fit inside that train, given the constraints that no one's going to be like surfing on everybody's head, lying down. So you try to push in too much, the train would explode, technically speaking, right? We're not stronger than the train, but if we're made of steel, we're robots, the train would explode. It'd just start bulging. That might be what happens when you try to stuff too much ether into a particular orbital configuration. Have you ever seen a bug that looks like a leaf? And it seems like, oh my God. I mean, I'm pretty sure God's having a great time up there messing around. But there's a praying mantis species that looks like a leaf. Some of them are brown, some of them are green. And I mean, you look at their little wings, it looks like a leaf. I mean, identical. There's, butterflies that have the same anomaly. And you wonder, how could a living insect who's not a plant create a plant facsimile that's absolutely perfect? The reason being is that the laws of how mass moves in the universe is unified. Again, a lot of you have seen this recently. We've had a couple posts on our Facebook page of the vascular system of a lung and the branches of a tree. And it's identical. And you know that there's plenty more examples of that. Again, there's a lot of videos on YouTube where they burn wood with electricity. And the way it crawls across the electricity, or crawls across the wood surface, is exactly the shape of a lung vascular system or the branches on a tree. It's the exact same thing. Now, could you imagine, you want to be a doctor, you're a kid, and you're like, I want to study the vascular system of the human body at a level that no one else has figured it out. And so you take that kid, or you go, if you're the kid, and you go to a forest that has trees with a massive number of branches. Because some trees don't, right? They go way, way up, and they do have them way up there, but they're, 200 feet up and you can't see them. But a nice little tree like the one I have that's in the shadows back there, where the spaceship lands, it's essentially a big vein. That's what it is. Same way it spawns a little branch is the way the vein works. But now, at the end of a branch, you get this new anomaly called a leaf. Well, the same thing that makes a leaf on a plant is the same thing that makes a leaf on a tree. Same thing that makes that wing on a mantis look exactly the same. Everything's made of ether. Everything has to obey the laws of ether. And you'll notice that veiny thing comes out of the center of the initial spine of a leaf. A leaf starts out really teeny tiny, right? And then it creates little ribs that go out to the edge. And then it just kind of webs it together between the ribs. The thicker ribs / spine of a leaf is obviously the main thoroughfare for the water that would come up from a root, or the blood that comes up through a mantis. It's obeying the same laws. Color? Well, it's just fortunate that they have different colors. It's amazing. I know we're talking about antimatter, but I want you to get a really good grasp of ethereal winds and how it affects everything, so that you see the universe as just one whole thing. So one of the uses that they're starting to put together is in the medical industry. Most of you are familiar with like a CAT scan or other scanning hardware, software, where they're hitting you with a bunch of particles of a particular kind. Sometimes they will shoot two things at once and find out how it splashes off of each other, and then based on that they can designate whether or not it's a bone, a vessel, a piece of tissue, and they can start creating these images of your body. I had my body scanned in my early 40s just for the hell of it, because I wanted to know if I had any genetic heart problems, or if I had any cholesterol plating in my arteries in my heart, and I was in the top 3%, basically with nothing. But it created a three-dimensional image of my body. I actually surfed through my body. It's amazing. Now, what they're doing is, by finding antimatter behaviors in mass and finding out when it occurs, they're able to recognize that. If you don't build a sensor for something, you never know it's there. Once you build a sensor for it and you understand how it behaves, then you can introduce a bunch of new inventions based on that. But they found these natural circumstances where positrons are emitted during various scanning procedures, and now they can start recognizing them, and then of course studying how they behave through human flesh, so that they can recognize it and perhaps show us more detail in our body. The beautiful thing about sensing a really small atomic element is that the imaging resolution becomes insane, which is great. There's in most 3D software, they're now starting to play with what's called voxels, VOXEL. And it's a binary concept of either a cubic space, literally a six-sided cube, is either on or off, based on what is creating the sense of whether or not that's on or off, and what color it might be, meaning it might be bone color, it might be blood color, it might be tissue color of all kinds of different densities. They created this back in the 80s, at least by the 80s, where they were using it for imaging systems of tissue. There was a company, I believe, called Novalogic back in the late 80s, early 90s. They had this game called Apache, which used a voxel terrain system to create these beautiful terrains, like just canyons, but then they put polygon helicopters in there. And the beautiful thing was that the terrain in voxel mathematics is extremely fast, because you can do what's called voxel clipping, which is if you can't see a voxel, you just stop processing. So you only process the layer of these little tiny cubes, which can look very smooth when you crank up the resolution. But it's very quick for old computers, the old 386, 486 computers, to give you real-time software rendering. And then you can give all your processing power to the textures and polygons of your helicopter. Guy made a ton of money. It's amazing. But the resolution is so high today that now software like Blender 3D, which you can download for free at blender.org, definitely get into that if you have any interest in becoming a 3D artist, because the community is massive. The product is super powerful. It's what I created that UFO with. Free software, people. You got to know how to do a bunch of wild stuff to get that kind of thing to happen. But believe me, just YouTube it until you figure it out. But that is sort of the medical use that's going on. Plus, they're trying to figure out a way to treat cancer by manipulating antimatter. Now, again, they're never going to have tremendous amounts of antimatter in a hospital unless we have some revolutionary way to create it for under a few $100 million. I mean, it's just an infinitesimal amount of antimatter will run $250 million. So that, you know, these techniques are in their infantile stages, but it's actually very interesting. But I want to tell you, between episodes, you know, I am constantly looking at the universe in an ethereal way. I read papers where it is like, I read the papers about antimatter to do this episode. You see these scientists and you almost wonder if they're all fudging it, or if they're all just, I wouldn't say blissfully ignorant, but totally ignorant about ether. Because once you start conceptualizing ether and seeing the examples I keep giving you over and over again, I keep giving you very simple ones so you don't get confused, hopefully. You read these papers and you're like, guys, if you would just reintroduce ether into your world and then reread all your research papers, especially the theory papers where no one knows whether or not it's true or not, or how it works, or why antimatter would give off a tremendous amount of energy when it hits mass, it all clicks and it all explains itself. And you want to be there. You want to be on the, literally on the event horizon of research, because you are acknowledging the universe for exactly what it is. And whether or not you're looking at a plant in my backyard, a tree, a scan of your lung, anything, it all homogenizes together. You don't need to know exactly to the, you know, ethereal particle exactly how everything works, but I bet you could by studying the bigger things, right? As it is above, so too is it below. So you just use that theory, which is a very beautiful line. I mean, if God wrote any sentence for man to hear, it is that sentence. But you want to reverse it every once in a while too. As it is below, so too it is above. So, you know, when you study science, and especially any level of atomic physics, particle physics, you really have three realms that this science is applied to. The realm you're in, which is the seeable, observable universe. Then you have your subatomic universe, which is everything that's teeny tiny that you can't discern with your eyeball. And then you have the macro universe, which is what is essentially the cosmology universe. How many of you learned about the golden mean, or otherwise known as the Fibonacci pattern, and you immediately realize that you're onto something? And you know that, chronologically speaking, you didn't invent it. You know, you weren't the discoverer of it. It's been in the universe for its existence, but it's also been in artwork, and, you know, from tiles in cathedrals to Da Vinci, or I should say Leonardo's work. Again, we got to stop saying Da Vinci for Leonardo's name. Da Vinci means from Venice. It's not his name. His name was Leonardo. Sorry for making a bunch of lighter noise. I had to refill it here. But you start seeing the Fibonacci pattern in your backyard. You see it in a rose. Again, you see it in a cactus. You see it all over the place. You look at the thorns coming out of a rose stem. If you look right down the barrel of it, they're coming out in a perfect spiral. They actually come out of it right on a rhythm. It's amazing. So you see that and you're like, oh my God, I'm starting to see the universe. I'm starting to see how this thing's put together. But then you can't go any further than that sometimes. That was my experience about 4 years ago when that really hit me hard. But what I want you to do is to realize you're starting to look right at ether. You're starting to see it work. You want to see some ether working? I don't care how old you are and how silly you might feel. Go to your kitchen. Get something to stop up the drain. Fill that thing right to the brim, right to the point your wife or your husband's going, what are you doing? And you're like, shh. Give them the Christopher Walken, shh, you know. Not the Illuminati one, but the Christopher Walken one. Way more impressive. And then reach in slowly and pull the plug out. And then watch that vortex. Watch it. Pay attention to it. You are looking at the algorithm of the universe. I mean, you're looking at it, and you're looking at it in a, I wouldn't say two-dimensional method. You are seeing it in 3 dimensions, but you're not seeing it in the spherical methodology, but you are definitely seeing it, the vector of force and the natural spiral. Every time I take a shower, because I have long hair, every other day or so I got to kick the hair off the drain before it's going to drain, right? So I hate that process. As soon as you kick it off, the water that's been still, I just immediately see it spiraling like a galaxy right down the hole. And it's funny because the suds from like hair shit, it starts to look like stars. And you sit there and you're going, my God, I'm just looking at a galaxy spinning in the universe. Yeah, yes, I have not seen a galaxy through a telescope personally. Just the images that they give to me, which is really sad because obviously when you look at the news and you see anyone tell you that there's a black hole here and there or some planet they found, they literally give you like a Star Trek rendering. And, you know, your layman's going, man, that's a photograph of a faraway planet. It's like, no, it's not. If it was that close, we'd fly to it, okay? Now, they're telling us, okay, that they can, through a spectrogram, through some shift of light, they can see antimatter because they study the emissions, the wave emissions off of space stuff, right? The center of the galaxy. I love the way they can supposedly look at the center of the galaxy and just see all this light coming off of it. Well, yeah, I have seen the Milky Way in the most stunning sense. A lot of you have. You can go out in the remoteness. I've been on Havasu Lake when it's as still as glass. I was in Copper Canyon, if you know that, or Copper Cove, excuse me. And it's just still. I've been on the boat. I do the Titanic thing where I stand right on the edge of the boat. And so I've got a landscape that's just this piercing little landscape, which kind of turns into bigger, you know, mountainscapes on the side, you know, little, not mountains, but like little cool hilly formations. And I got the Milky Way coming up in front of me, and it's also mirroring down on the lake, so it feels like you're standing in space. It's the most disorienting thing you've ever seen. And if you've had a few Jaeger bombs, it gets more distorting. But I grew up in Kansas where you'd have to just drive maybe 2 or 3 miles out of town from my little teeny town, and I'm sitting in an observatory basically. Instead of seeing 1,200 stars, I'm seeing 2,500 stars once my eyeballs acclimate. I don't know about you, but I have never seen anything that looks like the center of our galaxy when looking at the Milky Way. Ever. And if there's supposed to be this big bright spot in the center of a galaxy, because you see all those spiral galaxy pictures that they show us, wouldn't it be really bright for us to see the center of our galaxy? In fact, could that be muted during the day by blue atmosphere? I tend to think not. And I know it's a far away thing, but light's pretty powerful. And if I can see a star that's supposed to be way, way out there, I should be able to see definitely the center of our galaxy, which is supposedly this, today, it's this BS theory of a black hole in the center of the galaxy. I don't know why they so want the black hole thing to be there. Judging from all of the doomsday predictions of black holes by NASA, especially in other science institutions, it's a cash cow. That little fear-mongering BS theory is a huge cash cow. And again, I'll say it again. I was a black hole addict all the way through the 80s and definitely half a decade into the 90s before Hawking and a bunch of other folks said, yeah, if these things exist, they immediately dissipate, so they don't exist. And then one book later, he's talking about how they exist again, like someone smacked his hand or wrote his book for him, right? Here's the good news. Because there is so much doomsday stuff at the black hole level. But I'm in my backyard. You might be in your car, your living room. You might be in your backyard. What they want you to believe is that the universe is so utterly unstable, which is just, it's a funny sum total by ignorant scientists that are, I guess, trying to be smart. I don't know. Maybe they really are trying to be smart. Maybe they're dumb, and because they know a few concepts that blow people's minds forever, their neighbor goes, man, he's smart, whatever. But they want you to believe that we could just be sitting here in the backyard, all of a sudden, right next to my head, antimatter happens, an event horizon starts, and kapoof, here comes a black hole, and it's going to suck me into it, and I'm going to die. Even the theory of a black hole requires 4 of our suns at the minimum amount of mass, and this is all BS, up to about 12 times the size of our sun. Anything lower, smaller than that, 3 or less, turns into brown dwarfs and other things, white dwarfs. Anything higher than 12 times the mass of our sun would supernova and never turn into an event horizon, thus a black hole. They don't exist. They don't exist. They don't exist. Okay? If they exist, the very creation of them, behavior of them, and existence is completely and entirely different than anything man has ever theorized. And it would only be probably true based on a tiny little anomaly that light is in a pattern of movement by which it is stuck in this pattern, but it will not gain, okay, because gravity is not mass pulling against mass, it's displacement, okay? So, for instance, if you had a bunch of mass really, really dense somewhere in the universe, and let's say it crushes down to the size of our moon, take 12 suns and you crush it down to the size of the moon. Let's just give that as a theory. What they want you to believe is that's going to have more gravity than if our moon was right next to it. Why? Because they say if there's more atomic particles inside this ball, because in their theory, particles talk to each other and exchange mass, which is totally incorrect, that you're going to get this giant suck towards the one that's the black hole, and the moon's just the moon. It's cool. The truth of the matter is, because gravity is displacement of ether, especially ethereal winds flying all over the universe, there might be a little bit more of a violent speed around the one that is the black hole, but it's generally going to displace the same amount because it takes up the same space in space. And gravity is simply going to be, hey, I can't get through this thing. Okay, well, plasma ball has the same exact property. It can't get through this thing. Now, again, there might be a little bit of a difference, but it wouldn't be this big sucking thing where everything gets sucked into it. That's my current deep-held belief. It's why the Big Bang can't happen. Because there's not enough ether on the outside, okay, which is mass, pushing on this ball to make it super duper tiny to the point it has no gravity at all. I mean, they're pushing Big Bang in so many television products and movie products. It is insane, let alone all the crap you hear on the internet and college courses. They'll actually reenact college courses. And I just saw that Russian movie Attraction on, I think it's Amazon Prime. It's a cool little weird reenactment of the day the Earth stood still, sorta, without the Earth standing still. That part doesn't happen. But they filmed a professor in some school, and he was talking about it, and he was talking about the singularity and no mass and all this other stuff, just pumping it through. Now, chances are the writer believes what they're writing into their script. They just want to put a scene in their script where they sound like they're covering the bases of a school. And they want to have something that sounds smart. we're never going to get anywhere until we throw that crap out and move on. So hopefully that was entertaining and educational on some level. I hope that when you get to the end of these episodes, you feel driven to reanalyze your universe, to maybe do some research. And what's fun about it is, I will tell you, even though science with a capital S and flying quotes is almost categorically the opposite of the truth, once you gain an understanding of ether, through all the simple techniques I've given you in all these episodes, what's beautiful about it is you can read all those incorrect papers and your brain will automatically start translating it to the truth, or a hell of a lot closer to the truth than their stuff. Theoretical papers, why people are confused about things. They can get it up to the point of having to acknowledge ether, and then because they can't acknowledge ether, they immediately, the paper, you'll read a history and they'll go, well, and they bailed out because they couldn't get it any further. Had they endorsed ether, boom, they would have gotten to the next level. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. And remember to subscribe, hit the bell, all that kind of stuff, because a lot of people are being unsubscribed. I got to remember to say that now. But we have 2 options now for video, and BitChute is just literally probably 24 hours from being completely up to date with the YouTube feed. So if you want to see episodes that have been turned off, it's funny, I'll tell you, gun control, again, was banned worldwide on YouTube for really no reason at all. And on BitChute, it's my #1 episode. How do you like that? How do you like that? There you go. Shadow banning is anti-shadow banning. Ha! But we have a couple different options. There's all the audio feeds are up there, just easy little links. If you want it, go to the device that you're going to listen to the podcast on, go to the website and just click the link and it automatically happens on your phone. It's cool. No technicality required. But we have 2 social media outlets. We have Twitter, which is just, again, the feed of the videos. It's getting passed around quite a bit on Twitter, which is cool. I mean, I would expect it to be 0, so it's not 0. That's cool. But on the Facebook, I want to re-explain, because it's been a while since I went through it. It's a locked Facebook group, so you can live in privacy unless your boss or your family members join the group, which they won't. No one will see what you're talking about. You have freedom to be cool. Now, everyone's super cool on this page. I mean, again, we have ebony and ivory all over that page. People believe completely opposite things, but they treat each other with great respect. And it is a great feed all day long. The moderators, Dave and Kaz, they work to get you guys approved, get your post approved. I participate as well. When you do join the group, there's a question that basically says, say something human. And so we want to make sure that you just say anything, just gobbledygook, just smash your keyboard. That's fine. But we got to see that you're real. Now, if you forget and you look like you're real, we'll go to your profile page for a split second, take a look around, make sure you're not selling products. Anyone who posts a product that's totally unrelated to what we're talking about, watches or purses, you're out forever. You're blocked. If I go to your page and all you're doing is moving product, and I don't mean your own product or something logical, but something that looks like it's from some Chinese website, you're not going to get in. If you see people behaving weirdly, the moderators will take care of this too, but we will clean it out. We really don't want any eyes on us that we don't want. So, let us know. The other one is the little donation link. We've got PayPal for direct linking. I'm actually getting a lot more PayPals from BitChute now, which is pretty cool. So for all of those that donate, I can't find out your name. So as far as I know, you're completely anonymous. So I wanted to reply to someone and say thank you, but there's nothing. So if you want to have complete anonymity when you donate, that's the case. I've been putting people in the credits who have been donating, so if I could ever find anyone's name, I'll put you in there. So I apologize if you're not in the credits, but you've been donating your hard-earned money. But anyone who gets on Patreon, Patreon is cool because you get the links sometimes days ahead of time. If I'm doing a double feature on a particular day, you may not get the second one before it's ready, because I'm kind of rushing. I just want to get everything out the door, but at least 80% of the time you're going to get it before everyone else. So there's a little benefit for you. Plus you get it in the credits, which is cool. There is a piece of software called Backblaze. I use it. It's $5 a month. infinite backup on 2 systems with $5. It has, again, Save My Bacon. You're going to hear this a couple times. One, I just want you on it because it is the cheapest cloud service I've ever found. I don't know if it's deep state or not. I mean, who knows? Anything that transmits over the internet, they got a copy of it. Probably anything on our computers, they got a copy of it. And we'd have to have some awesome new security OS if we want to live in total blackout phase. And there's the Brave internet browser, which is based on Chromium, which is another sort of open source browser, which I don't believe has any association with Google, but they block all your traffic. They block all of the ads trying to play on your browser. They block all the movies that try to autoplay. But the coolest thing they do is they block the trackers. And the trackers are where they stitch together your profile online. So if you don't want to have a virtual profile of yourself constantly updated about what products you buy, what websites you view, whether you're conservative or liberal or whatever, Brave browser is awesome. And it even keeps track of your minutes saved by using their browser, because they know how long things were going to take to load, and they just keep adding that in there so you can see it. So after 6 months of use, you will have saved tens of thousands of minutes of loading time. So that's super duper cool. And of course, if you're on the YouTube channel, if you're on BitChute, this isn't the case. BitChute has all Season 1 on it. But if you're on YouTube, on this particular channel, you'll look for YouTube, or you look for my videos in Season 1, which is basically 100 to number 1. They're not on here. They're still active in an unlisted fashion, so if you've ever embedded them on your web page, you don't need to worry about changing the link. It still works perfectly. But I've created a remastered Season 1, took off all the custom soundtracks, which were causing me all kinds of viewing problems as well as monetary problems. But the new channel has no monetization whatsoever. It probably never will achieve that type of viewership to ever be monetized. So you can get in and out really quick. Plus, I've probably removed, I don't even know, probably a day's worth of pauses in the videos. So it's nice and clean. So it's cool. I want to get you over to see the best copy of everything. As well, you're always welcome to give me ideas for episodes. There's a few ways you can do that. Obviously, Patreon is the fastest way to get it to me. YouTube comments is a little slower because there's thousands of YouTube comments coming in constantly. The Facebook page is also a decent one. Your best bet for me to see your particular comment is if you were to post an original comment in the Facebook page, that's going to get driven down very quickly. So if I miss the page for 4 hours, I may never see your comment, especially if one of the other moderators approves it. So the best thing you can do is when you see an episode that I've posted, reply to the episode. In fact, I think if you reply to any of them, it tells me very specifically, so-and-so replied to your post. And of course, I'm going to read it. And I keep a list on my computer of every potential episode I could do. I probably have 50 potential ones. The problem is 48 out of 50 need a lot of research, and I'm simply too busy to do all that research. So if you want me to cover something very complex, you may need to help me produce that video. So find me resources. If you have a 4-hour video you want me to watch, do me a favor and maybe find the minute marks that I'm supposed to view to really get the scoop. If I am totally intoxicated by your suggestion, I will sit down and watch 4 hours to do an episode for an hour and a half. So it's sort of hit and miss. We'll see. But anyway, I want to thank every single one of you for joining the channel, watching the videos. For those old-timers who have seen every single video and some of them 5 or 6 times, you're the boss, let me tell you. So anyway, until the next episode, take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.